Wilson Waters wiped the sweat from his weathered brow as he finished fixing a broken fence post on his sprawling 100-acre farm just outside the sleepy market town of Ashford in rural Kent. At 55, his hands told stories of decades spent working the land. Rough, calloused, and steady. Yet beneath the farmer's rugged exterior lay muscles honed by a very different kind of training. His steely blue eyes scanned the gentle hills where his sheep grazed peacefully. A stark contrast to the war zones he'd once haunted. Another beautiful day in paradise, he muttered to himself, a phrase he'd picked up during his 20 years with a shadowy government agency. Back then, talking to himself was a lifeline during long undercover assignments in places so secret, they didn't even appear on official maps. The creak of the back door announced his wife, Claire, stepping out of their modest farmhouse. She was on the phone, her voice low and urgent. Even at 48, Claire retained the sharp, striking beauty that had caught Wilson's eye 15 years ago in a bustling London cafe. That day, he'd been recovering from shrapnel wounds after a classified mission in Eastern Europe. Claire had been a rising star in real estate, ambitious and sharp as a tact. I told you, Martha. The property prices in Ashford aren't going to rise anytime soon, Claire said into the phone, barely glancing at Wilson. I'm wasting my best years in this backwater. Wilson's jaw clenched. He had sacrificed everything for this woman. His career, his purpose, his very identity. When they married, he told her he was a government consultant. A vague enough job description that she never pressed for details. The agency had been glad to let him disappear after a disastrous operation left 3 operatives dead and Wilson questioning everything. Claire's sister, Martha, had been whispering poison in her ear for years. While Wilson built their modest life through honest work, Martha lived in London's affluent Chelsea, married to a city councillor with a reputation that raised eyebrows, as dusk painted the sky in fiery oranges and purples. Wilson sat on the creaky porch, watching the sunset. These quiet moments were his refuge, a replacement for the adrenaline-fueled chaos of his past. Inside, he heard Claire's voice filtering through the thin walls. I know, but he's getting older and there's that life insurance. No, Martha, I can't just leave him. He'd get half, including the farm. My solicitor confirmed it. Wilson's blood ran cold. Years ago, he had installed surveillance equipment around the property, a habit from a man trained to expect the worst. He never thought he'd need it at home. Moving silently, skills that had saved his life in the mountains of Afghanistan. Wilson slipped to the side of the house where a discreet panel hid the recording devices. His fingers barely trembled as he activated the audio enhancer, built with parts that officially didn't exist. Just be smart about this, Claire was saying. Make it look natural. An accident on the farm, tractors are dangerous. After all, Wilson closed his eyes, feeling the familiar coldness settle over him. The same detachment that had once made him the agency's deadliest operative. In 18 years of marriage, Claire had never asked about the scars on his back or the nightmares that sometimes woke him screaming. She'd been content living off his pension and the farm's modest income, never curious about why a simple consultant received payments from so many government departments. But now, her words cut through the evening like shards of glass, and Wilson began to remember who he was before the quiet life. Operative Shadow, the man sent to erase entire terrorist cells without a trace. Tomorrow, he whispered, voice low and deadly, we see what you're really dealing with, Claire. The first light of dawn slipped quietly over the rolling fields of Ashford as Wilson sat alone in his study, a room Claire had never taken interest in, assuming it was filled with farming ledgers and tax receipts. In reality, behind a cleverly disguised panel triggered by a sequence of taps that looked like restless fingers fidgeting, was a hidden arsenal and intelligence hub that would have made his old colleagues at MI6 nod in grudging respect. Wilson retrieved a weathered, encrypted phone, its battery still holding a charge despite 15 years of dormancy. Built for hostile environments, these devices were as durable as his resolve. His fingers moved with the smooth precision of muscle memory, activating tiny listening bugs no bigger than a grain of sand. At exactly 3:17 a.m., his patience was rewarded. Claire's phone buzzed, and she answered in a hushed tone. The urgency of a conspirator barely disguised. It has to be tomorrow, came the sharp voice of Martha. Brett's in town. He owes me a favor from that little incident last year. He'll make it look like a robbery gone wrong. Wilson's mind cataloged the information with cold efficiency. Brett Wilkins. Claire whispered back, Martha, he's dangerous. What if nothing? You said Wilson's getting suspicious. You've been asking questions about his business, and Tony can't afford that kind of attention right now. Tony Khan, the city councilor, Martha's husband, and a man whose fortune was whispered to be built on backroom deals and political maneuvering. Brett Wilkins was muscle for hire, a shadowy figure with ties to London's criminal underbelly. Martha's voice came back with a sneer. What's Wilson going to do? Chase Brett with a pitchfork? He's just a worn-out farmer who never made anything of himself. By the time dawn broke, Wilson watched Claire go through her morning routine with the detached precision he once reserved for hostile targets. She brewed coffee, applied makeup in the mirror, and called in sick at the local estate agency. All while planning his assassination. I'm visiting Martha today, Claire announced without meeting his eyes. Probably staying overnight. She's having problems with Tony. Of course, Wilson replied, voice cold. Give her my regards. Claire drove away in their silver Ford Focus toward London. Blissfully unaware that her carefully laid plans were already unraveling, Wilson began preparations of his own. From a hidden safe, he pulled out gear that brought memories rushing back. Body armor, encrypted comms, and enough explosives to send a message. But first, intelligence gathering. Using credentials that should have been long deactivated, Wilson accessed secure government databases through a laptop disguised as a farming tablet. Within minutes, he had dossiers on Brett Wilkins, Tony Khan, and a web of associates that made his stomach churn. Brett Wilkins, 34, had served 2 tours in Iraq before being dishonorably discharged for violent conduct. Since then, he'd been the go-to enforcer for London's criminal networks, arrested 3 times, never convicted, with a reputation for making people disappear. Tony Khan was worse. A man whose greed had cost lives. The school collapse in Canterbury 3 years earlier that killed 2 children, the contaminated water scandal in Ashford, all traced back to corners cut by companies linked to Khan and Martha, the queen bee of this rotten hive. Using charm and cunning to shield her husband's corruption while maintaining an elegant facade, Wilson studied surveillance photos of the trio dining at an upscale Mayfair restaurant. A plan began to form. Not a swift, silent kill, but a calculated strike designed to expose their entire network and give them the justice they deserved. By noon, the farmer was gone. Operative Shadow was back. And when Shadow hunted, survival was a matter of luck, not skill. The early morning mist clung to the fields around Wilson's farm as he moved with the quiet precision of a seasoned hunter. Brett Wilkins was coming at first light, predictable, impatient, and dangerously overconfident. Amateurs always thought dawn was their advantage. Wilson knew better. He'd spent decades turning the break of day into his most lethal weapon. He had transformed his peaceful farm into a deadly maze. Pressure plates disguised beneath fallen leaves and stray branches would trigger silent alarms. Motion sensors cleverly concealed in fence repairs would track every movement. And scattered throughout were devices that could harness the morning sun itself, turning light into a weapon. At 5:43 a.m., the perimeter alarms flickered to life. Through a thermal scope that was, of course, not in any official inventory, Wilson watched a lone figure slip through a gap in the fence. Brett Wilkins, moving with the brute force of a street fighter but lacking the discipline of a soldier. The man carried a Glock 45 and a crowbar, tools as crude as his plan. Break in, kill the farmer, vanish like a ghost. When Brett came within 50 feet of the farmhouse, Wilson triggered the first phase. A series of small, carefully placed charges erupted along a narrow escape path, exploding with a controlled fury that blocked the route and simulated a gas line blast. Blimey! Brett cursed, spinning toward the sudden flames cutting off his retreat. In that moment of chaos, Wilson struck. He emerged from his hiding spot like a shadow come to life, movements fluid and precise. His combat knife sliced through the tendons in Brett's gun hand before a sharp blow to the solar plexus dropped the younger man to his knees. Brett Wilkins. Wilson intoned, voice cold and authoritative. Born in Liverpool, dishonorably discharged for assaulting a superior officer. Currently employed by Tony Khan to solve problems voting can't fix. Brett's eyes widened. Breath shallow. This was no farmer. This was a predator reborn. Wilson tied Brett's hands with climbing ropes, keeping him conscious but immobilized. You're gonna call Martha and tell her the job's done. Describe finding my body in the barn, shot during a struggle. Can you do that? Terror replaced Brett's arrogance as he nodded. Good, Wilson said, activating Brett's phone and holding it close. It's done. On the other end. Martha's voice trembled. Found him in the barn. Must have heard me coming. He's dead. Thank God. Looks like a robbery gone wrong. Wilson deepened his voice to sound pained. But we need to talk in person. It's complicated. After arranging a meeting at a remote warehouse on the outskirts of London, Wilson ended the call and looked down at his captive. Phase 1 complete. Now, the real game was about to begin. Wilson couldn't help but smile grimly. Yesterday, he'd been a farmer fixing fences. Today, he was Operative Shadow, and his enemies had no idea what they'd stirred. And when Shadow hunted, mistakes were fatal. Brett Wilkins sat shackled in the reinforced cellar beneath Wilson's barn. A concrete bunker disguised as a storm shelter, but outfitted with surveillance gear and interrogation tools that would make any criminal think twice. The afternoon sun filtered lazily through the barn's slats, casting long shadows across the cold floor as Wilson prepared for the next phase. You know, Brett, Wilson began, adjusting the discreet microphones around the room. Back in my old line of work, we had a saying. Every thread leads somewhere. Right now, you're the thread I'm pulling to unravel the whole tangled mess involving Martha and Tony. Brett squirmed against his restraints. The bravado that had accompanied him that morning now a distant memory. Look, mate, I don't know who you think you are. Operative Shadow, Wilson interrupted sharply. That's who I was. Before I made the mistake of believing I could live a normal life with a woman who saw me as nothing more than a walking insurance policy. Wilson tapped a tablet, bringing up surveillance photos of Tony Khan shaking hands with contractors and shadowy figures lurking in dark alleys. Martha was there too, smiling sweetly as she negotiated with a man known in the underworld as Luther Montgomery, a notorious money launderer. She's the brains behind this, Wilson said coldly. Bribes, intimidation, and the disposal of obstacles like you. Brett swallowed hard. They'll kill you if you keep poking your nose in. Wilson smiled, a cruel twist of lips. I know all about connections, Brett. 3 years ago, I intercepted chatter about a money laundering scheme right here in London. Middle Eastern terrorists. I thought it was federal business, until I realized it was Tony Khan and his cronies. Brett's face drained of color. I didn't know. Of course you didn't, Wilson said. You're just the muscle. Martha and Tony knew exactly what they were doing. They planned to use my death to cover their tracks before the feds caught on. Wilson flipped through bank records, intercepted communications, and financial transfers that painted a damning picture of treason disguised as municipal corruption. The school collapse in Canterbury? Deliberate sabotage. The water contamination in Ashford? Cut corners sold to the highest bidder. They've been selling out our infrastructure to the highest bidder, all while innocent people suffered. Brett whispered. Jesus, Wilson's eyes were ice. If the feds had caught wind earlier, we wouldn't be having this conversation. But they already know. That's why I'm still alive. This isn't revenge, Wilson continued. It's an off-the-books operation. I'm still with the agency, just in deep cover. Help me, and I'll make sure the Justice Department cuts you a deal. Refuse, and you'll be charged as a co-conspirator. With a sentence that won't come with a pardon. Brett's resolve broke. What do you want me to do? Wilson handed over a secure phone. Call Martha. Tell her you need to meet tonight instead of tomorrow. Say you fought harder than expected and there are complications. As Brett dialed, Wilson felt the familiar thrill of a plan falling into place. Martha's greed and paranoia would make her walk right into his trap. A trap 20 years in the making. Tonight, Wilson whispered. They'll learn exactly who they've been messing with. The sprawling construction yard sprawled across the outskirts of London's gritty East End. A bleak patchwork of rusting steel beams, half-finished concrete slabs, and towering cranes silhouetted against the night sky. Wilson arrived 2 hours before the scheduled meeting, moving with the silent confidence of a surgeon preparing for a delicate operation. From his vantage point perched atop a decommissioned crane cabin, he surveyed the entire complex with hawk-like precision. Motion sensors discreetly embedded among the rubble would track every footstep. Directional microphones captured every whisper and hushed conversation, and strategically placed explosive charges, carefully calibrated, could turn the entire yard into a controlled environment, where Wilson held all the pieces till exactly 9:15 p.m. Headlights pierced the darkness as Martha's sleek silver BMW rolled through the main gate, followed closely by Tony Khan's ostentatious black Range Rover. Behind them came a third vehicle, a black unmarked sedan that screamed government business. Wilson's pulse quickened as he adjusted the scope. Identifying the occupants, Luther Montgomery climbed out of the driver's seat, but it was the passenger who made Wilson's blood run cold. A woman in her 40s, moving with the poised efficiency of a seasoned agent. Wilson could just make out the glint of a federal badge clipped to her jacket, Special Agent Julia O'Connell from the Serious Fraud Office. Well, Wilson muttered into his throat mic, looks like the family reunion just got a federal upgrade. Through his directional microphones, Wilson listened as the trio converged near Tony's office trailer. Martha glanced nervously at her phone, while Tony paced, his usual swagger replaced by jittery paranoia. Where the hell is Wilkins? Tony snapped. He should have been here an hour ago. Martha's voice trembled. He said there were complications with the farmer. Maybe Wilson fought back harder than expected. Agent O'Connell stepped forward, her voice cutting through the tension like a scalpel. Mr. Khan, Mrs. Davis, we need to discuss your involvement with several overseas financial institutions, specifically transactions that violate anti-terrorism financing laws. Wilson watched as Tony and Martha exchanged panicked glances. They'd stumbled into a federal trap, but they didn't yet grasp how deep the hole was. I want my lawyer. Tony blustered, but his voice lacked conviction. That's your right. Agent O'Connell replied smoothly. But first, let's talk about Wilson Waters. We know you've been plotting against him. Wilson's breath hitched. How much did the authorities know about his past? How long had they been monitoring the conspiracy? Martha Davis here decided cooperating was her best option, O'Connell continued. She told us Wilson Waters has been asking questions, making connections that put your entire operation at risk. Wilson's voice, calm and controlled, came through their radios like a ghost from the past. Wilson Waters is exactly where I need him to be. Are you ready for what comes next? Suddenly, floodlights snapped on, illuminating the yard in harsh white light. The three groups scattered, seeking cover behind machinery and vehicles, scrambling to locate the source of the voice. This is Agent O'Connell, Serious Fraud Office. A megaphone blared. Wilson Waters, identify yourself. Wilson's voice echoed back, modulated and unrecognizable. Agent O'Connell, I'm not a threat. Check your secure channel for a complete intelligence package documenting your suspect's crimes. Everything you need is waiting. As federal agents stormed the yard, Wilson activated his final move. The explosive charges erupted, not to kill, but to create walls of fire that sealed off escape routes, corralling the criminals like prey into a cage. Surrounded by flames and law enforcement, Martha and Tony's empire crumbled. Wilson exhaled slowly. The operation was a success. But as he slipped away into the night, one thought lingered. Claire had no idea he was alive, and Wilson was coming home.